So, when did the modern revolution begin? When and how was the explosion of the modern revolution ignited? What are the signs we should look for? This is a question very similar to the one we've asked about earlier thresholds, such as the threshold leading to the appearance of human beings or agriculture. In the next two lectures, I try to answer these questions to define and identify the moment at when the threshold was crossed, and I'll do so using ideas sketched out in the previous lecture. What I'm going to do is to survey world history over roughly the last 1500 years through two Malthusian cycles to see if we can detect elements of modernity falling into place. Remember what we mean by Malthusian cycles. These are cycles in which population growth may initially stimulate growth in other sectors of society, economy, even culture, or the expansion of political systems, but eventually population growth outstrips growth in resources, and that leads to an eventual collapse of populations, of states, and sometimes entire civilizations. And that's why we call it a cycle. This lecture describes what I'll call the medieval Malthusian cycle. It begins roughly in the middle of the first millennium, about 500 CE. This is not long after the decline of the Roman and Han empires, and it continues to about 1350, the time of the Black Death. The second cycle we'll look at in the next lecture I'll call the early modern Malthusian cycle. That begins at the time of the Black Death, about 1350, and lasts until about 1700. In this first lecture, as we follow the medieval Malthusian cycle, we'll focus almost entirely on Afro-Eurasia, which was the largest and most significant of the four world zones, but it was also the region that probably drove most change in the early stages of the modern revolution. So here's our strategy. We're going to focus on one key aspect of modernity, accelerating innovation, because, as I argued in the last lecture, this seems to be the key to understanding all other, or at least most other aspects of modernity. Consequently, we're going to try and keep our eyes on three crucial drivers of innovation, three factors that might have led to an acceleration in rates of innovation. And let me remind you, these three are commercialism, that is to say the spread of competitive markets and of entrepreneurial activity associated with markets. Secondly, the spread of capitalism. And thirdly, a rapid expansion in the extent of exchange networks. So we'll ask, can we detect any evidence of an increase in the importance of these drivers of innovation that might help explain an increase in rates of innovation? And we'll also try and find if we can see in this period any evidence that rates of innovation are beginning to rise. So we'll be asking, did commercialization raise productivity by encouraging specialization? This is Smithian growth. We'll ask, did entrepreneurial activity and wage earning, the two key features of capitalism, become more important? And if so, did they tend to accelerate innovation? And third, we'll ask, did exchange networks expand? And if so, did they stimulate commercial activity and information exchanges? The other thing we're going to look for is signs of a shift in wealth and power to a new hub region around the Atlantic. Remember, the great powers, that is to say the major centers of both of wealth, of urbanization, of high culture, and of political power during most of the later agrarian era could be found around the Mediterranean, in the north of the Indian subcontinent, and in China. The great powers of the modern revolution so far, and I have to say this because this could change within a generation or two, have been located in the Atlantic region. And that was a region that was completely marginal to world history before the last millennium. So can we detect the beginnings of this shift in wealth and power from the traditional centers of Eurasia to the Atlantic region, a region that was completely marginal before? Northwest Europe, remember, was an area of barbarians, even in the time of the Roman Empire. The eastern seaboard of the USA had even less connection with major centers of agrarian civilization. And finally, there's one more thing we must keep an eye out for, or at least remember during this discussion, and that is the idea of accumulation. During the 4,000 years of the later agrarian era, despite Malthusian fluctuations, we saw that on a long trend, populations increased, markets expanded, and new technologies emerged in much of the world. Without this slow accumulation of skills and resources and technologies and experience, the modern revolution could not possibly have occurred. So this was the foundation for it all, the slow accumulation of wealth, populations, technologies, and organizational skills during the later agrarian era. That was the foundation. Okay, let's look at the medieval Malthusian cycle, which ran, I remind you, from about 500 CE, that's a largely symbolic date, I mean somewhere in the middle of the first millennium, to about 1350 CE, the time of the Black Death. Let's begin with population figures, because Malthusian cycles are most easily seen as patterns of rise and fall in population. Now, I'm going to have to ask you to upload into your imagination a sort of graph drawing machine. I'm going to give you the figures and see if you can mentally draw the graph. It's not that hard, and it's a fairly simple graph. You'll need first to place dates along the vertical axis. So let me give you the crucial dates. Here are the dates. The first is 600 CE. Now that's 2 centuries after the fall of the Roman Empire. The second date is 1000 CE. That's when the Vikings set up a colony in Newfoundland that didn't last long, but it's the first contact that we know of between the Eurasian zone and the Americas in recent millennia. That's the second date, 1000 CE. The third is 1300 CE. Marco Polo has just been released from a Genoese jail where, with a fellow convict, a writer of romances from Pisa called Rusticello, he's just completed an account of his travels to China. That's 1300 CE. And the fourth date is 1400. In Mesoamerica, the Mexica, from their city in what is now Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, were beginning to build the Aztec Empire. So here are the data you need to add to the graph. And remember, our 4 dates are 600, 1000, 1300, and 1400. European populations rose from about 22 millions in 600 to about 30 millions in 1000 to about 70 millions in 1300, and then they dropped to about 52 millions in 1400. There's the Malthusian downturn. But if you look at this sequence of figures as a whole, you'll also see something else. And that is that the long trend is still a rise. Even after the collapse, populations in Europe are larger than they were at the beginning of the cycle. So that's why I argue that Malthusian cycles, for the most part, seem to have been cycles on a rising trend. Now, here are the figures for China. 49 million in 600 CE. 56 million in 1000 CE, 83 million in 1300 CE, and 70 million in 1400. You can see the same pattern. You can see the Malthusian downturn, and you can also see the general trend, which is towards increasing population. And finally, the figures for the Indian subcontinent, and once again, we're going to see the same thing. Here are the figures. 37 million in 600 CE, 40 in 1000, 100 in 1300, and 74 in 1400. So that is a kind of graphic sketch of this medieval Malthusian cycle. Now let's look at some of the things that happened during this cycle. Well, commerce develops very rapidly. In fact, so fast during this cycle that the historian Robert Lopez claimed that there was a commercial revolution in Europe in the later Middle Ages. And Robert Lopez and many historians of his generation have often been inclined to think that this is the key to understanding modernity. But since he wrote, several decades of work by world historians have shown a slightly different picture, and that picture is that the commercial revolution was not just a European phenomenon. It affected all of Eurasia. As in all Malthusian cycles, growth began with innovations that stimulated population growth. New technologies included improved strains of rice in China and improved ploughs and yokes in Europe. We've already met these improved yokes. They allowed you to harness a horse without choking it when it pulled too hard, because they were attached more to its shoulders than to its neck. Populations grew fastest in regions such as South China or East Europe that had previously been underpopulated frontier regions. Population growth in turn stimulated growth in other sectors of society. They stimulated commerce as villages and towns expanded. There's more exchange between them. They stimulated urbanization, the appearance of new towns, of new villages, of new major cities. And they also stimulated cultural efflorescence. Where there's a lot of money about, you find patrons and you find governments with spare cash, and they may invest it in things like Gothic cathedrals. So the number and size of cities and the richness of the culture they could support increased throughout Eurasia. And populations became very dense in this period. According to Asa Briggs, by the late 13th century, and I quote, "A bigger area was cultivated in England than at any period before the wars of the 20th century." Baghdad and Cairo were among the largest cities in the Muslim lands that dominated the Eurasian heartland. But by the end of the cycle, it may have been that China was the most urbanized region in the world. By the 12th century, China may already have been extremely highly urbanized, with well over 10% of its people in the towns. Hangzhou, Marco Polo's Kinzai, that's what Marco Polo called the city, was the capital of the Southern Song dynasty, and it may have been the world's largest city with at least 1 million inhabitants. It contained many different suburbs. It contained working-class suburbs with crowded, multi-story houses. It contained foreign quarters with sections for Christians, Jews, and Turks. It had a large Muslim quarter with many foreign traders, and it also had a wealthy southern region that was dominated by government officials and rich merchants. And we have some idea of the astonishing variety of trades conducted in the town. Jacques Giernet's list of the guilds of Hangzhou include jewelers, gilders, glue makers, art and antique dealers, sellers of crabs, olives, honey or ginger, doctors, soothsayers, scavengers, bootmakers, bath keepers, and money changers. So in this period, the largest cities in the world could probably be found mainly in China. Let me remind you that wonderful list of different professions is what Smith is talking about when he's talking about the division of labour. People becoming more and more specialised in very highly specialised professions or activities as the size of the market expands and can support more and more highly specialised professions. Now let's look at trade networks. We've looked at some of the phenomena of expansion in this period. Now let's look at trade networks. Trade networks, or networks of exchange is another phrase I've used, reached further in this era than they ever had before. Muslims dominated the Silk Roads, which were, I suppose, the sort of backbone of exchanges in Eurasia. They extended, as we've seen, from China through to the Mediterranean and down into India. But Europeans were increasingly active. So Europe, which had been a marginal zone in the time of the Roman Empire, is becoming increasingly significant in international exchanges. By 1300, Vikings had reached Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, where they established the short-lived colony of Newfoundland in 1000 CE. While Venetian traders, such as Marco Polo, had reached China. Indeed, in Marco Polo's time, in about 1300 CE, just after, publishers began issuing regular travel guides to travelers heading for China. These are sort of medieval versions of the sort of travel guides we use today, except they're aimed primarily at merchants. So they tell you about prices, where you find translators, what sort of money to take with you, what sort of goods to take with you, where you're going to make your best sales, and so on. As exchange networks increased commercial activity and other exchanges between different regions, capitalism flourished. And as capitalism flourished, wage earning and entrepreneurial activity expanded. Let's begin with wage earning. Wage earning is a crucial part of the story. We saw that in agrarian civilizations, peasants, as a rule of thumb, probably made up 90% of the population. They are not very specialized, and for the most part, they have limited incentives to innovate. So as the number of wage earners expands in society, this itself may be a very powerful index of commercialization and of the emergence of more capitalistic types of societies. What very often happened is that peasants in many regions found themselves sucked into capitalist networks. Government demands to pay taxes in cash could force them to try and find cash. If governments will no longer accept payment in kind, in animals or in eggs or in wheat, you have to find cash and you have to look beyond your peasant farm for it. Land shortage could also drive them to seek cash if they don't have enough land to support their household. Also can indebtedness. They run into debt, then they're going to have to pay their debtors in cash. Or the need to buy goods on markets. All of these forces could drive peasants to earn cash, and that meant drive them onto markets in various ways. They could earn money by selling surplus produce, but generally that was available to the wealthier peasants. Or they could earn money, perhaps by selling goods, such as textiles manufactured in the households. Now this, of course, means they're functioning not just as pure peasants supporting themselves from the land, they're also functioning as petty artisans. They might be making silk, they might be making textiles, but they're half in the peasant world, they're half in the wage-earning world. Or finally, if things get really tough, peasants might send one or two members of a household to seek wage work as labourers in nearby towns or on nearby farms. So in all these ways, peasants could slowly find themselves getting sucked into networks of commerce and wage earning. And these are some of the very subtle ways in which peasantries slowly began to turn into classes of wage earners. In this sort of environment, entrepreneurs also flourished. Their power was particularly striking at the edges of the great empires, in Southeast Asia or in the Mediterranean, where powerful small trading states flourished, such as Venice or Genoa. In fact, in those cases, we're talking about states where mercantile activity is so important that merchants actually rule them. Now, to illustrate the power of some of these changes to stimulate innovation, I want to focus in on China between 960 and 1279 in the era of the Song dynasty, because the history of China in this era illustrates very well the transformative power of these changes. First, let's go back in time. Since China was first unified in 221 BCE by the first unified emperor Shi Huangdi, China had been the very epitome of a traditional agrarian era tribute-taking empire. Its rulers controlled huge revenues, exacted mostly in the form of tributes from a vast peasantry, and most of those tributes came from the land. And like most agrarian elite groups, they tended to despise commerce, even though markets flourished in China and played a pretty significant role in its economy. So here we have a very conventional tributary state. But then in the 10th century, things start to change. Now, this is a pattern that had occurred before as central government broke down and was then revived. But the striking thing about China is for how much of the last 2,000 years it was ruled by unified governments. And we'll see Europe's very different. In the 10th century, North China was conquered by dynasties originating in Manchuria and in Tibet. Suddenly, China, instead of being a unified empire, is divided into three large warring states. And the Song dynasty is now confined to the south. Its rulers find themselves facing very serious military challenges from their rivals to the north. And they also have a shrinking tax base because they rule a smaller area. And this poses very severe problems. You have very severe military problems, and you've got less revenue to deal with it. So what happens is the Song rulers suddenly find that despite their distaste for mercantile activity, they're forced to start exacting revenue from commercial activity. And that means they're forced to start working with entrepreneurs, with merchants, and in fact behaving a bit like the entrepreneurial rulers of commercial city-states such as Venice or Genoa. Here's one piece of evidence of this. In just 200 years, the share of Chinese government revenues from foreign trade rose from just 2% initially, a tiny share, to 20%, a quite substantial share. Not surprisingly, the Song government began to back traders and to encourage trade, including foreign trade. Now, our model of drivers of innovation predicts that if commercial activity becomes more and more important, if governments start supporting it actively, we should expect innovation to accelerate. Does it? In a now classic study, Mark Elvin, the study's called The Pattern of the Chinese Past, describes the remarkable acceleration of innovation in this era. Here are just some illustrations of it. There were innovations in agriculture. New strains of rice from Vietnam led to rapid population growth in the south. And it's striking that the use of these new strains was actively encouraged by government propaganda using woodblock printing so that they could distribute leaflets to provincial officials telling them how to use these strains, how to encourage their use, and so on. In manufacturing, government factories produced 32,000 suits of armour each year in the 11th century. In this period, iron was produced in amounts that would not be matched again until the Industrial Revolution in 18th century Europe. And copper production rose so fast that ice cores taken from Greenland glaciers today show a sudden increase in atmospheric copper pollution in this era. In weaponry, this was the era when gunpowder first began to be used in war. So there's an astonishing range of innovations. It really looks as if innovation is beginning to take off. So we have to ask, was China, Song China, perhaps on the verge of an early industrial revolution as society and governments became more commercialized and more capitalistic? Well, foreign trade's a wonderful illustration of this. Particularly striking in this period are advances in naval technology. Between 1405 and 1433, a Muslim admiral and eunuch, Zheng He, led 7 huge Chinese fleets with up to 60 ships and 40,000 soldiers in voyages to India, Southwest Asia, and East Africa. On the coast of East Africa, you can still find the remains of Ming vases left by these expeditions. And we know that at least one giraffe was brought back by these fleets to China. There's no good evidence, incidentally, that his ships reached the Americas, though they might have had the ability to do so in theory. Zheng He's largest ships were at least 5 times the length of Columbus's ships. They had watertight internal compartments. They used compasses to navigate. All in all, this is fantastically sophisticated navigation. And it shows that Song China is not merely highly commercialized, highly innovative, but it's also beginning to reach out to other parts of the world. Then what happens? In 1279, a Mongol dynasty, which took the Chinese name of the Yuan, reunited China under a ruler named Kublai Khan. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan. And in 1368, the Yuan themselves were overthrown by a new Chinese dynasty, the Ming. So now what you have is a reunited China. Many of the pressures on governments to engage more seriously in commercial activities of various kinds are now off. The pressure diminishes, and they can revert to the behavior of much more conventional agrarian tribute-taking states. And they can fall back on the norms of Confucianism and traditional cultural attitudes which despised commerce. Slowly, government practice reverted to the anti-commercial, tribute-taking methods of earlier times. The amount of revenue from trade diminishes. Governments stopped backing commerce and trade, and the Ming even tried to ban foreign trade. It was in this period that the voyages of Zheng He are ended. So innovation slowed. It slowed partly because reunited Chinese governments had less need to support commerce. So the entire commercial activity of China, instead of being backed by states, is now being stifled by state activity. But the other reason why this did not lead to a sort of takeoff was because the world as a whole was as yet too disconnected for innovations to spread rapidly. So what was happening in China didn't turn out to be the starting point for a global industrial revolution. Some of the changes, some of the innovations, such as gunpowder and use of the compass, did indeed diffuse slowly across Eurasia, but it took a long time. In the mid-14th century, then, the medieval Malthusian cycle ended, and it ended in a crash that affected most of Eurasia. We find signs of ecological overreach in many parts of Eurasia. It's been particularly well studied in Europe. You find overpopulation, you find increasing numbers of famines, you find weakened populations more subject to disease. Overpopulation and malnutrition becomes more common, and then eventually, in the middle of the 14th century, the plague spreads from China through Central Asia to the Mediterranean world. In many regions, it killed off a third of the population. What this crash suggests is that rates of innovation, though impressive in some regions, were still not yet rapid enough to match population growth. So the Malthusian pattern would continue. In 1350, the main structures of agrarian civilizations, including tribute-taking elites and peasant farmers, remained firmly in place, and Eurasia was still dominated by the traditional hub regions. So the structures of the later agrarian era still seem to dominate change in the history of the whole of Eurasia. The commerce, capitalism and international exchanges flourished during the medieval Malthusian cycle. And remember, we call it a cycle precisely because it doesn't lead to sustained growth. They could not yet overcome the technological inertia that was characteristic, as we've seen, of most agrarian civilizations. And this is why the medieval Malthusian cycle, for all its innovation, for all the growth that occurred during it, should not count as a significant turning point on the road to modernity. The next lecture is going to survey changes during the early modern Malthusian cycle, which lasted from 1350 to 1700, and we'll ask the same questions. Is there any evidence here that we're on the verge of a breakthrough? Thank you. The medieval Malthusian cycle. It begins roughly in the middle of the first millennium, about 500 CE. This is not long after the decline of the Roman and Han empires, and it continues to about 1350, the time of the Black Death. The second cycle we'll look at in the next lecture I'll call the early modern Malthusian cycle. That begins at the time of the Black Death, about 1350, and lasts until about 1700. In this first lecture, as we follow the medieval Malthusian cycle, we'll focus almost entirely on Afro-Eurasia, which was the largest and most significant of the four world zones, but it was also the region that probably drove most change in the early stages of the modern revolution. So here's our strategy. We're going to focus on one key aspect of modernity, accelerating innovation, because, as I argued in the last lecture, this seems to be the key to understanding all other, or at least most other aspects of modernity. Consequently, we're going to try and keep our eyes on three crucial drivers of innovation, three factors that might have led to an acceleration in rates of innovation. And let me remind you, these three are commercialism, that is to say the spread of competitive markets and of entrepreneurial activity associated with markets. Secondly, the spread of capitalism. And thirdly, a rapid expansion in the extent of exchange networks. So, when did the modern revolution begin? When and how was the explosion of the modern revolution ignited? What are the signs we should look for? This is a question very similar to the one we've asked about earlier thresholds, such as the threshold leading to the appearance of human beings or agriculture. In the next two lectures, I try to answer these questions to define and identify the moment at when the threshold was crossed. And I'll do so using ideas sketched out in the previous lecture. What I'm going to do is to survey world history over roughly the last 1500 years through two Malthusian cycles to see if we can detect elements of modernity falling into place. Remember what we mean by Malthusian cycles. These are cycles in which population growth may initially stimulate growth in other sectors of society, economy, even culture, or the expansion of political systems, but eventually population growth outstrips growth in resources. And that leads to an eventual collapse of populations, of states, and sometimes entire civilizations. And that's why we call it a cycle. This lecture describes what I'll call. So we'll ask, can we detect any evidence of an increase in the importance of these drivers of innovation that might help explain an increase in rates of innovation? And we'll also try and find if we can see in this period any evidence that rates of innovation are beginning to rise. So we'll be asking, did commercialization raise productivity by encouraging specialization? This is Smithian growth. We'll ask, did entrepreneurial activity and wage earning, the two key features of capitalism, become more important? And if so, did they tend to accelerate innovation? And third, we'll ask, did exchange networks expand? And if so, did they stimulate commercial activity and information exchanges?